In this video, we're going to continue cleaning up Tour of Heroes project from Angular. In particular, we're going to be cleaning up the test code. If you've been watching any of my previous videos, this is simply a continuation from those. So I've got my notes up. We're going to be focusing on the hero class. So let's jump into the app.ts. You'll find that in E2E test specs directory. And inside of this file is where all of the test code is contained, all the end-to-end test code, I should say, including all the support functions and classes. And in a small project like this, that's probably okay, but as your project grows, or if you're already in a bigger project, that's going to be very difficult to maintain. So let's get into the habit of splitting up this code into smaller files. Let's start with the hero class, so go ahead and click on it. Click the light bulb. For some reason I want to say lightning bolt, but it's a light bulb. And move it to a new file. You'll see that that code was replaced by an import. And if you look at the project structure, you'll see that there is a hero.ts file right next to our app.ts. That's okay, but that will get hard to maintain as well if we've got a bunch of files in the same directory, in particular the test specs directory. So let's create a new directory under test called support. And so now we've got a specs directory and a support directory. Let's move the hero.ts file into support. VSCode is going to ask us if you're sure. You might want to click the checkbox. I'm just going to click move. That way the dialogues show and people can follow along. VSCode's now going to want to know if we want to update our imports. Same thing, you could do always automatically update imports. That way next time it doesn't show this dialog. I'm simply going to click yes. As you can see, app.ts updates and shows us that the file is now in the support directory. One little thing that I would like to do is also rename this by making it lowercase. That way it matches the style of our other files. So right click, rename, or you could do an F2 and just change the file name. And similarly, another dialog is going to appear asking us to update our imports. So yes. Pretty simple. As you can see, the import's correct, no compilation errors. So let's run our tests, make sure we didn't break anything. You might notice that the tsconfig is showing an error. We'll fix that in just a second. Perfect, 22 passing tests. I didn't really expect anything to fail. This is a pretty simple refactor. Okay, so back to tsconfig. If we open this up, you'll see that if you hover over the squiggly, the red squiggly, it's going to tell us that it can't find capital hero.ts. And that's simply because sometimes VSCode caches some incorrect information. This is really easy to fix. I'm going to do Shift-Control-P. That brings up the command palette. And you can see that I've already done this before, but type in restart and you'll have a few different options. The one you're looking for is TypeScript restart TS server. And this is going to restart the TS TypeScript engine that's running in VS Code. You give it a few seconds and then you'll see that the error goes away. So that's easy. Nothing really to be alarmed about, just a little bit annoying. If you do see that, you can just restart the TS server. All right, so this is looking good. Let's go ahead and commit this code. You know me, I like to commit things in small increments. So let's call this E2E hero class test code cleanup. How about that? It's a long name, but I find that it's better to be more specific. That way it helps your teammates figure out exactly what you're doing if you're working on a project together. All right, so let's go into the commit view and take a look at the changes we made. So yep, moved the hero class out. It's now an import and moved it into its own file. So that's, again, very minimal changes, but it's good to do these in small pieces. So work in progress, cleaning up, we'll say E2E test code. And moved hero class into its own file. Let's go capital H Hero. Commit that and publish that branch. All right, next up, we're going to take a look at the Hero class, and we're going to see how we can make it a bit more robust and less fragile, at the same time simplify the code. So let's go back to our project view, and let's open up the Hero class. And as you can see, there's two static methods in here, from.li and from.detail. These are both creational methods. What that means is that these methods are used to actually create Hero objects. The way it does that in both of these is by looking at specific elements on the page, an li element, and then a specific to the application, a detail element, and pulling out certain pieces of information and generating a hero from that information. If you dig into this a little bit further, you'll see that it does that by splitting on a space, also using the index of spaces, finding some divs, finding an H2. All of those things are very fragile. It's relying on the presentation of data, which could change as the application evolves. These two methods are used all over the place in our test code, which means if those changes do occur in our application, these are going to break, and all of the tests that use them are going to break. So that's way too fragile. We would want to dig into this and see how we can make these less fragile and more robust. So let's start with the from.li and see how this code is being used. So I'm going to do a control click or a command click, and this is going to show us where this is being used. It's only being used in one place, so it drops us directly into the code that's calling it. However, this is a little bit misleading because this is simply a wrapper around this call. So we really want to know, where is toHeroArray being used? We want to get back to the test code that's calling this. So we'll do a control click on this as well. And we'll see that it's actually being used in 4 places. Where it's currently highlighted is the code we're looking at. But if we go up further, we'll see that it's used in these 4 locations. And what's nice is it actually, VS Code gives us a little brief summary of how it's being used. So each time this is getting called with all heroes. And all heroes, if we kind of follow this through, so all heroes comes through, and then we iterate across all heroes and we pass in each of the elements from all heroes. So let's figure out what all heroes is. So let's go back to the very top. And all heroes comes from this function. It's this property right here, all heroes. And this is a selector. It's an array selector looking at AppRoot, AppHeroes, li. Since this is off of AppRoot and it's AppHeroes, this is the AppHeroes component within our application code. So we can drive directly to that area and dig in to see what's going on there. So let's go over to source, app, and then it's going to be heroes. So AppHeroes, AppHeroes. And if we open up the HTML, because that's all we really care about, we can see the structure of the code. And as you can see, there's an li that is being used. So this is going to generate a bunch of LIs for each of the heroes. And a quick way to see this, just to get a visual, it's a little bit easier to understand when you can see something. We'll do an npm run start. That's going to build the application and serve it up so we can actually see the code we're talking about here. I'm going to do a control click or a command click on this URL. This is going to open up the application. And what we're talking about is the heroes view. So if you click this button, this is the heroes view or the heroes page. And this is the list of LIs that we're looking at currently. So if we were to right click and do an inspect, we'll see the actual generated code. So here's a bunch of LIs, and each of these have an anchor inside of them. So that's what the code we were just looking at, that's what gets generated. We can go back here and we can see that. So here's the LI and an anchor for each of the heroes. And we've got an ID and a name. So really what this code is doing is it's scraping the ID and name by using a space character, splitting that and taking the first element and assuming that's the ID, and taking the second element and assuming that's the name. Again, that's a bit fragile, and we can do better than that. So let's go to the heroes component and let's add some test IDs so that we can actually zero in on the data that we care about. So there's already a span around the ID, so let's just leverage that. And we'll create a data-test ID equals, and we'll call this ID. And then we'll put a span around this as well. Oops. Let's move that code in here. And we'll add a data test ID as well. And we'll call this name. You could really call this anything you want. You could call it test ID, test-ID, but data-test ID is a pretty common attribute that the community uses for testing using various frameworks. So we're going to keep that standard. I like that. It's easy to remember, and you might come across it in other projects, so it keeps things a little bit more consistent. So that should be good. That should give us an ID and the name. And then we don't have to split on the space anymore. We can actually target the individual elements. And so that'll make it more robust. The other thing that's nice about having it be data-test ID is as this application code evolves, this will be a good indication that we shouldn't mess with the IDs here, that this is for testing, and if we change this, it's going to break our test code. So it helps it kind of stand out. But it doesn't really affect the presentation of our code. We can move this stuff around and our test code can still find the data we're looking for. And that's exactly what you want. You want to be able to separate the data from presentation and your test code from your application code. They should all be separate. All right, so let's jump back into our class and we can start modifying some of this. And just to be safe, we'll go and take a look at the served code is still running. And we can do a refresh, and we can see that the code still renders. Nothing's broken. If we go and look at the dev tools, we can inspect one of these elements. Whoops. Go back to the dev tools, and we should be able to see our IDs in there. So let's expand this. And we've got a span that has a data-test ID and another span that has a data-test ID and name. So that's exactly what we were expecting. And it applies to all of these now. ID, name. Perfect. So let's close these things. Let's stop serving. I'm going to do a Control-C. That'll stop serving the page. And we can go in here and make some modifications. So really what we're looking for is each of the LIs are going to come into this from-li method, and we want to dig into the LI a little bit further. So we're going to want to do something like const name equals await LI, and then this is going to be data test ID equals name, for example, and get the text. And we don't need all of the awaits. WebDriver IO is pretty intelligent figuring that out for us. It'll chain those commands together. And then we need the ID as well. And it's very simple. I'm going to copy and paste that code and simply change this to ID. And to keep things in the right order, I'm going to move the ID above the name, because I believe that's what comes first in our code. We've got an ID and then a name. It doesn't really matter. I'm just trying to keep things organized. But as you can see, so the LI comes in, and then we're going to chain off of that and dig in and find the ID and the name. So that's why we're working off of the LI. We don't need this code anymore. And we can do a couple of things here. So we can change this to ID and just make this name. So let's go ahead and rerun the code. Make sure we didn't break anything. Oh, and I can tell you right now we did. So I'm going to Control C out of that. This really should be a closing bracket here. So the selector is open bracket data-testid equals the name ID. So either ID or name and closing bracket. That's an attribute selector. All right, so let's rerun that. Don't forget your closing bracket. And we have one failing test. It looks like, so 21 passed, 1 failed. Shows Magneta X in the hero list. And it looks like it's expecting there to be a space, but there no longer is. So let's take a look at that. So we're going to control click on the failing test. That drops us to here. And we can see that it's looking for the ID and then a space and the name. And this is most likely because of how we wrapped the data in span. So let's do another npm run start and take a look at why this might be failing and if it's legitimate or what exactly is going on. So back to heroes. And we're not really going to have Magneta X in here because that's part of the test, but we can kind of fake it by looking at any of these. So if we right click and go inspect, yeah, so what's going on here is before there wasn't a span here, so there was actually spaces around the name, but now that we've made this code have more structure, which is actually better, the data is wrapped in a span, so there isn't any like erroneous spaces. And spacing should be handled by CSS, not by the structure of your page. So this is actually better code. We just need to adjust the test code to reflect that. So there isn't going to be a space. And as you can see, things are still displayed nicely because the CSS is handling the spacing between the elements exactly like it should be. So let's go back to our test code and let's make a small modification. There's nothing broken here. So really this is just simply the ID and then the name appended right to it. So we're removing the space because we don't really care about how this stuff is displayed. We just care that the data is coming across correctly. So let's go ahead and Control C out of the served page. Let's close all of these things. And let's rerun the test. Perfect. It's all passing now, so that's good. So this test is passing. Another thing we could do is we could have done a toContain and put in just the hero name. Because if we look at what's the purpose of this test, it's supposed to show Magneta X in the hero list. And if you look at the existing code, it's really looking up the ID and name. So that doesn't exactly align with what this test is about. It should only be looking for the name. So we could do a toContain and just put in the test_rename.name as the expectation, and that would pass as well, but that's risky. And the reason why that's risky is if there's any erroneous characters before or after the name, this is still going to pass because it's still going to contain the name we're looking for. So this is a bit better because it's going to use toEqual. So if there's anything erroneous, it's going to fail. Just like we saw, there was a space, so it failed. What we might want to do, and maybe I'll leave this up to you folks, is really modify this. This should be a more specific test. This should probably grab the name element, since we now have a name ID on it, we can go and target this specific thing and check that the renamed hero does indeed show up. So we could target the specific element, we could continue to use a toEqual, and then we could ignore the ID. So perhaps you would do something like find the anchor that has the ID that you're looking for, and then dig into it further to make sure it has the correct name. And that would be a very strict, specific test. It would also be less fragile because it's using data test IDs. So again, I'll leave that for you folks to play around with. Feel free to comment on that. If you've got other ideas or other things you'd like to see in regard to that, let me know. All right, let's commit that code. So back to the commit view, and let's have a look at what our changes were. So yep, had to modify that test ever so slightly. So let's use the up arrow, get the previous message. We are continuing, so this is still a work in progress. And we'll say something like updated the shows. We'll say, I don't know, we'll do like name in heroes list test to rely less on data presentation. Presentation, if I can spell. There we go. And no other changes in there, so next file, updated the hero classes from li, creational method, I think that's right, creational method to use data test IDs, making the method less fragile. Wow. Cannot type. Here we go. And that's fine. Okay. Oh, and I don't think I talked about this, but this plus sign, it's just shorthand. What it's doing is it's converting the string, which is what ID, get text returns a string, so ID is a string, and it's converting it to a number, which is what the hero class expects. It expects an ID to be a number and the name to be a string. That's all that's doing. Okay. And then we updated the heroes component to use data test IDs. Something like that. Let's commit and sync those changes. And let's clean up our workspace a little bit. Close the working tree stuff. We need to do something very similar to the other creational method. So back to Hero.ts, and we've got FromDetail. So let's do a control or a command click to see how this is used. And we can see that it's showing us multiple uses. So the current selection is the file and line of code we're currently on. What we really care about is stuff that's in the app.ts. So let's expand that. And we can see that this is used in 4 places as well. And each one of these is awaiting on the page hero detail. So that's pretty simple. It means that the hero detail component is what this code refers to. So that's going to be easy to look at. So let's escape out of this and let's go back to the project view, and we'll go to the hero detail component. So app hero detail, and we'll open up the hero detail component HTML file. And we can see a couple of things in here. So there's an H2 that has the hero name in uppercase. There's also a div that has the ID. So there's a span for kind of a label, and then the actual ID is not wrapped in anything other than the div. And there's some other stuff, some divs, some input fields, things like that, that we don't really care about. If we go back to here, we can see that the detail element comes in, and we go a bit further into it, and we look for the div, and we look for the H2. So we can do almost, and you're going to see this is going to be exactly the same code. we'll use data test IDs instead of digging into these things that could potentially change over time. So back to the Hero detail component. Let's put a span in here. And it's okay for a span to live inside of a header element, so an H2. And we're going to move this thing into here. And we'll leave the details by itself alone. We don't really need to wrap that. We don't care about it. And then the actual ID needs to be wrapped in a span as well. So we'll move this code in. And then we will use the data test ID again. Oh. Equals, we'll say this is name. And then this is data test ID equals ID. And if we go back to this code, we can literally steal this. We'll have to make one change because we're not dealing with an LI. We're dealing with the passed in detail element. So let's just paste right over this and we'll copy detail over LI. Again, so detail comes in, we dig into it by chaining a selector and looking for any element that has this attribute and it being, specifically it being the ID, so that we get an ID, and then this one being the name, so we get a name. And it's the same sort of structure. Again, both of these have to return a hero, so the structure is the same. And we use the shorthand one more time to convert the ID from a string to a number. All right, let's go ahead and run our test code again. So npm run E2E. And there we go, 22 passing tests. We did not break anything. So really nice, clean update here. And you might guess where we're going to go next. We've got duplicate code, so we can actually optimize this one more layer. But let's do an incremental commit, keep things kind of separate. So let's go to our commit view, open up our diffs, up arrow, gets us that last message, and let's update this. So we said, or what we did, we didn't say it. What we did is we updated hero classes, the hero classes from detail, oh boy, from detail creational method to use data test IDs, and updated the hero detail view or component to use data test IDs. All right, let's commit that, sync those changes. Really sort of my workflow is whenever the tests pass after a small change, I like to commit. That way I'm keeping my branch stable. All right, we can close those things. Okay, so as I'd said, probably the last thing we'll do in this video is we can do a real quick optimization. Let's remove this duplicate code. So probably want to create something private. Don't want to call this code directly. Static async. And we'll call this just from element, something like that, or perhaps from hero element. It's not an actual HTML element, but it's going to be anything that contains an ID or name as a data test ID. So we'll call that a hero element. This is good for internal use only. So we'll do an elm, and it'll be of this type. And we'll copy this code. Changing this to elms. Elm for element. And then we can replace this. So these will be return from hero elm, and we'll pass in the detail element. And then this one, we'll pass in the li element. Now in theory, we could scratch both of these and just have our code used from hero elm, but I like the idea of having some wrappers that give a little bit more context. So in some places we're getting it from the detail element, and in some other places we're getting it from the list element. So the extra layer of abstraction I think is a nice thing just because it makes the code a bit more self-documenting. Speaking of documentation, let's add some comment blocks. All right, so this is something like create a hero from a list li element. And this will be the list HTML element. And we don't care about returns. We'll let VSCode take care of that for us. And similar message for this one. Create a hero, capital hero, from a detail page element. And the detail page element. And then this private one, we will add create a hero from a hero page element. An HTML element that contains ID and name data test ID attributes. How about something like that? All right. One last run. Make sure we didn't accidentally introduce something strange, but those should just run and pass. Perfect. Still 22 passing tests. Let's go ahead and commit this last little piece. And this is no longer a work in progress. We can say something like cleaned up and organized the end-to-end hero class. I don't know, something like that. And what did we do here? We removed, or let's say extracted duplicate code from the hero class into a private method, added method comment blocks. Something along those lines should be good enough. Commit, sync changes. Before we wrap up, I noticed a couple of minor mistakes. These didn't cause any test failures, and I'll explain why, but let's go through here and let's make a few adjustments. So you'll notice that the from hero elm calls, they are asynchronous, but we did not await, so let's put in awaits on both of these. And the reason why this didn't fail, the calling code actually does the await. So indirectly, this code is being awaited on. The reason why this could be a problem in the future is if we didn't include these awaits and we added more code, it's very possible that the code would run in an order that we don't expect. And that would make it really difficult to debug. So let's correct that right now. The next thing that I want to adjust is to actually do a return type on this private method. So let's do a promise hero. And again, the reason why this didn't fail was because we are returning something that looks like a hero. So it's got an ID and a name. which is exactly what a hero looks like, an ID and a name. That's a number and a string. Also, this is a number and a string. So that's why this worked. Not a huge deal, but let's make it accurate. And again, a very minor thing. We're going to remove the annotation for returns. We'll allow VS Code to create that information for us. So you might see little mistakes like this from time to time in my videos. Definitely let me know, add a comment. I want to learn as well, and then I want to be able to provide those learnings back to you folks. All right, so with that being said, let's do a commit. And as usual, we'll look at the changes we made, and they all make sense since we just did them. So let's add a comment regarding that. So up arrow, and we'll say something like, fixed a few minor mistakes in the code. And maybe we'll do non-breaking mistakes. Fixed a few minor non-breaking mistakes. Commit that, sync those changes. All right, so if we go back to our app.ts, we've now refactored this a little bit by moving the hero class out into its own file. We simplified some of the code. We actually made it more robust by using test IDs. And I think that's a good place to stop for today. All right, if you've got any questions, comments, ideas about this refactor, let me know. Otherwise, have a great day and peace.